Okay, so my theme is liberalism and race. So I thought this sort of breaks itself down naturally into four components. Liberalism, race, what the relation between liberalism and race historically has been, and then what the relation between liberalism and race potentially could be. So why don't I start by, I hope I'm going to go up and down, I hope it's going to sort of interfere with the camera too much.
It's all right, go for it.
So I thought I'd start off by, sort of generally, what do we mean by liberalism? So, sort of get that on the table first of all. Okay, so of course I don't mean it in the sort of distinctive US sense of, the left wing, or these days, what sort of to the left of the Democratic Party, to sort of left liberalism. I mean liberalism, in the broad sense, liberalism as the ideology that emerges 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, the ideology of modernity, the ideology of individualism, egalitarianism, universal rights, the ideology opposed to ascriptive hierarchy, the ideology opposed to feudalism. So in sort of classic conflict between Locke and Sir Robert Filmer, later work of Kant, and then further developments, John Stuart Mill. So in this broad sense in which you have a liberalism that's committed to certain values, and then you have sort of variations within that. Okay, so what I thought I'd do just to begin is just sort of, give us a sense of what some of the traditional distinctions have been. So there's Lockean liberalism versus Kantian liberalism. There's liberalism associated with social contract theory, which has come back big, of course, into the work of John Rawls. And there was a liberalism that was dominant before that, utilitarian liberalism of James and John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham. There's left-wing liberalism, usually just denoted as liberalism in the US context. There's right-wing liberalism, far-right liberalism, such as libertarianism. So those are traditional distinctions, traditional divides that we're all familiar with. And now there's some relatively unfamiliar ones that I want to sort of get on the table. Okay, and what I want to suggest is that one crucial division is between what you would think of as actual historical liberalism, the way liberalism actually was, and a liberalism that in a sense has been retroactively sanitized. In other words, we're given a picture, a standard picture, painted in philosophy texts, history of political thought texts, and saying this is what liberalism was, or came into existence, what its commitments are. And I'm sure that this picture is in crucial respects a very misleading one, because it sanitizes liberalism. It doesn't sort of bring out sufficiently clearly how racialized that liberalism was. So you get a kind of Platonized version of liberalism in which Locke, Kant, all these guys were committed from the start to the freedom and equality of everybody, and it's just these ideas evolved in this Platonic sphere, and it really was not like that at all. That's one distinction, the actual liberalism, which we need to sort of recover, excavate, and bring into the light, and then sort of way it's presented. Another distinction has been made important by the work of John Rawls, so we're talking about in greater detail tomorrow in the racial justice section. This is liberalism associated with ideal theory. And as I say, I'll go into greater details tomorrow, but the idea is Rawls is saying, okay, we're going to focus on what a perfectly just society would be like, a kind of utopian society, and who could have any problems with that? Well, it turns out there are actually a lot of problems with that as a ladder. So there's ideal theory liberalism, which is a liberalism that Rawls has been a sort of preeminent exponent of, and all those people sort of commented on Rawls. And then I'm going to suggest there's a more useful kind of liberalism, which is liberalism of non-ideal theory. And basic point of my argument is that we need to sort of reorient liberalism so it's more useful to those who are subordinated, and the way to do that is to sort of do a sort of meta-ethical correction that is not focused on ideal theory but on non-ideal theory. Then, as a result of the work of feminist theorists who have made sort of greater progress in the academy than people of color, though still, of course, underrepresented. In philosophy in particular, it's about 20% of philosophers are women, largely white women, but it does mean that feminism is somewhat more respectable than race. So, as a result of the work of feminist theorists in the second wave onwards over the past few decades, you now have a concept of what you would think of as patriarchal liberalism. In other words, it's not that feminists are sort of putting this forward, let's have patriarchal liberalism. They're saying, we have had patriarchal liberalism all along. So the idea is sort of, expose existing liberalism, which is representing itself as gender neutral, and saying, look, these guys were wearing the pants all along, and you can see that in all these theories coming down. And then the idea is that you have some feminist theorists, late Susan Muller-Okin, Martha Nussbaum, various people saying, we need to sort of see what we can do with liberal theory and sort of adapt it and sort of take it over and turn it towards feminist ends. And then what I'm basically arguing for, and this is sort of anticipate tomorrow, I'm arguing that a parallel exercise can be done and should be done in terms of race. And that because of the underrepresentation of people of color, the idea of racial liberalism or white supremacist liberalism, that's not such a familiar concept. But I'm arguing that you can sort of run a sort of parallel line of critique and show that there's this sort of racial bias in liberal theory. And then correspondingly, what we need to argue for is an anti-racist liberal theory, part of which is going to sort of take up the task of exposing the racial bias of previous dominant liberal theory. And then this sort of will go to the ultimate bottom line, which is that existing liberalism has, too often been complicit with injustice, oppression of various kinds. But what I'm going to claim, much to the horror and dismay of some of my former friends, I wouldn't say former, some of my friends who are sort of at greater distance than they used to be, shall we say, and they accuse me of selling out and so forth. And what I'm going to say is that a radical liberalism is not oxymoronic. A radical liberalism is possible that sort of takes these things into account. Oh, so all that is then sort of many rather than single liberalism. Okay, so how do we set about this? Well, I suggest that one way is to try to sort of, I hesitate to use the word deconstruct because that would make me a postmodernist, which I'm not. So let's say I want to sort of take apart liberalism and say, what's the essence of liberalism? In other words, if you were asked what sort of key points of liberalism, what would they be? And I'm suggesting here are what, you could sort of see as a sort of essential elements of it. So first of all, there's a set of value commitments. And the idea is, liberalism is committed to the freedom and equality of the individual. And of course, that, has these classic historical resonances, echoing down in the American Revolution, Jefferson's famous Declaration of All Truths be self-evident, all men are created equal, the slogan of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, and then of course, not usually part of the sequence as the Haitian Revolution, but we won't talk about that just now. But the idea is, liberalism coming to sort of freedom and equality of the individual, and as such, there's this point that you are locating people as individuals rather than members of social estates. So it's no longer the case that your primary identity is as a lord or a serf, as a knight or a lady. The idea is that you're an individual. And the idea is that given that you're an individual and that classic liberalism, contractarian liberalism, you're supposed to have these rights and freedoms in the state of nature, these are then supposed to be translated into a polity which respects those rights and freedoms in terms of its social institutions, in terms of the political structure and so forth. So that, in a sense, is sort of core of liberalism, this commitment to the freedom and equality of individuals and to their rights. Okay, you then have certain other things involved with that. So B, there's a certain social ontology. Okay, and what would a philosophy lecture be without a word like ontology or metaphysics thrown in? The APA sends around people to sort of monitor, people are giving philosophy lectures, and if you do not mention ontology or metaphysics, a black mark is entered beside me. So I don't know who this person is in the room, but I can show you there's somebody from the American Philosophical Association you're watching. So a social ontology. So what do I mean by that? Basically, you're sort of saying, okay, here are the crucial existing entities of the social world. So this might be a bit scary to philosophers. That sounds like it's edging over into sociology. And we know that these sociologists, you don't get involved with them because that's not philosophy. So this is sort of where philosophy sort of interfaces with sociology, talking the social ontology, the sort of crucial social entities. And the term itself, of course, comes originally from George Lukács, famous Hungarian Marxist, and sort of took it over from Marxism. You don't find the term in Marxism itself, but you find the idea in Marx, the idea that you can think of social structures as having such a fundamental molding effect on human beings that there's a sense in which they create humans at a deep metaphysical level, but it's not a naturalistic metaphysics, it's a metaphysics which is historically variable. And the whole point, of course, of Marxist is to say that people are molded by class membership, so that in the kind of human you are, to a significant extent shaped by this. And then other people have taken this over for race and gender. Anyway, the social ontology traditionally associated with liberalism is the social ontology of atomic individuals. In that you have these people in this sort of pre-social stage, the so-called state of nature, they're wandering around. So it has seemed to some that liberalism is sort of committed by definition to an atomistic social ontology. But the other people have said no, that's a misleading reading of liberalism. And that, for example, T.H. Green, late 19th century liberal, had a very sort of different conception of human beings. So I'm going to say that there is a social ontology, but we shouldn't assume it's necessarily an atomistic, individualistic one. Okay, along with the social ontology, you need a mapping of the territory. In other words, a conceptual cartography. So, for example, this area is here, this area is here, this is separate from this. And you can imagine, for example, gendered versions, there's a public sphere, there's a private sphere. You can imagine bourgeois versions critiqued by the left, where the economy is sort of sharply partitioned off from society, whereas Marxists want to say the economy affects them, etc. So the point is, any version of liberal theory is going to have to give us a certain mapping of the socio-political order and how they think the sort of crucial categories fall out. And that's going to be linked to the social ontology. Okay, then D, again, classic, scale of rights, protections, and freedom. So the idea is, as a good liberal, you're committed to people having these rights, and of course there's going to be controversy over what the content of those rights are. Do they include welfare rights? They are just sort of restricted sort of negative rights of non-interference. You're going to sort of some schedule of rights. And what I'm going to suggest is that if this part seems boring, because stuff, as good Americans you're all brought up on, rule of law, due process, actually in recent times this has not been so boring, has it, considering the violations thereof. So yes, not boring at all, but even more or less boring if you consider what would the possibilities be if you have a revised ontology, if you have a revised mapping, so that you might need additional rights, additional sort of measures, sort of take account of gender and racial subordination. And then finally, E, a theory of history, not in the Marxist sense, of course, but liberalism has sometimes been taken as also a kind of Whig progressivism. In other words, everybody's getting more reasonable, more enlightened all the time, we're sort of in a better and better world. And obviously, the mere fact, we think that reason and freedom and rationality and morality should prevail doesn't mean that, as a matter of fact, they do. So again, this is a sort of account of history linked with liberalism. You can see the connection is very weak and contingent. So the claim I'm going to make is that of all these, A to E, the only one which in its sort of existing version is really sort of crucial to liberalism is A. And B, C, D, and E are all variable. And the implication of that is that if we had a different social ontology, if we said that society was significantly different from its sort of standard represented by liberal theorists, and according with that, a sort of different mapping of the socio-political terrain, then that could mean radically different right schedules. So part of what I'm trying to do is to sort of open up liberalism and say, we have this picture of liberalism, and it's because in part the existing liberalism has been so hegemonic. But you can imagine alternative liberalisms once you recognize the sort of contingency of the character of B, C, D, and E. And the fact that dominant liberalism has said, well, this is social ontology, this is sort of mapping, this is right schedules, that doesn't mean you have to accept it. And the crucial element of liberalism, the core of liberalism, the heart, is really just the commitment to the rights and freedoms of the individual. And if you take that crucial commitment and change B, C, D, and E, you can get a liberalism which is radically different from the ones that we know. Okay, so that's liberalism. Now, race. Okay, how do we think of race? Well, I have a neat diagram here for you which you can sort of put up on your, your refrigerator, your bathroom wall, any place you do your serious thinking, you can just sort of cut it out and stick it there. Okay, so basic categories. How should we think of race? Well, you could say, well, race doesn't exist. And this is an increasingly popular view. As you all know, the election of Barack Obama proves we're in a post-racial epoch. So Barack is a post-black kind of guy, and all around us we see the evidence of post-blackness, while Skip Gates making this big fuss because the cop is arresting him in his living room and so forth. We're in this post-black epoch. So post-blackness, this is sort of pretentious way, and as I say, what is philosophy for except for being pretentious? So the pretentious philosophical term for those who work on race is racial eliminativism. And what you're basically saying is that we're now sophisticated enough to recognize that race has no biological existence, so let's get rid of race as a term. Race does not refer to anything in the real world, let's get rid of race, and let's all be colorblind. So you can see it's sort of color blindness, which is sort of in a dominant position in the white majority today. You can see color blindness as a kind of commitment to racial eliminativism. Race does not really exist. And the contrasting position, of course, is, unsurprisingly, racial anti-eliminativism. And that way you say, no, not so fast, race does exist. And racial anti-eliminativism breaks down, I suppose, into two main categories. Racial naturalism. And that, of course, has been the traditional position on race. Races do exist, they exist as natural kinds. The human race is naturally divided into blacks, or let me put it in terms of continents, Africans, Asians, Native Americans. There's this sort of crucial biological distinctions between them, and then you can sort of extrapolate from that particular cultures, particular mental traits, particular psychological dispositions. Now, it's classic racist theory. So classic racist theory is an example of naturalistic racial anti-eliminativism, and the idea is that most of us, or certainly everybody in this room, I know how sophisticated you guys are, we're beyond that. Okay, here's a point that various people have been trying to make in critical race theory for some time. Race does exist, but its existence is not biological. Its existence is socio-political. And this, of course, is now expressed by the cliche, race is constructed. So the idea is that race does have a real existence, but the nature of the reality is not a naturalistic one. The nature of the reality is a socio-political one, linked to this idea, as I say, of a social ontology. So to take myself as an example, so this is a standard example I'm fond of using. Okay, so camera is to lift up, I guess. Okay, so here I am lecturing to you guys, and you think of me doubtless as Charles Mills, black philosopher at Northwestern. Now, why do you think of me that way? You think of it that way because in this country, the racial rules where it comes to blacks have for decades been centered on what is called the one-drop rule. And the one-drop rule basically says any black ancestry makes you black. And this is a particular social convention that eventually crystallizes into sort of US practice, and it reflects basically a perception of blackness as stigma. Blackness as sort of contaminant. So the idea is, if you think of it in terms, here you are in your Beverly Hills mansion, you have a big swimming pool, and then there's this sort of, if you think of those things under your kitchen sink, those heavy-duty plastic containers like a Drano. So think of something like sort of essence of black to get sort of hold at a distance to get burned back. You sort of tilt one drop of it into the swimming pool, and the whole thing turns black immediately. Such is the power of blackness. So the idea is that black is basically seen as contaminant. Blackness is seen as something that sort of pollutes the bloodstream so that you're no longer racially pure. And of course, there's an extensive discourse in the US for decades, racial purity, and of course, taboos against racial intermarriage and so forth that comes out of that. So the point I want to emphasize is that my blackness in the US is purely conventional. Now, if I were to go home to Jamaica, which is where I'm from, I would cease to be black. The reason being that in Jamaica, the racial rules or the color rules are different. In Jamaica, historically, there's been a social pyramid which is based on 3 layers, the white, the brown, and the black. So if I go home to Jamaica, I immediately become what we call in Jamaica a brown man rather than a black man. And if I were to sort of talk about blackness and Charles, you've been too long in the United States. You need to come down to earth. Who are you? Everybody knows who you are. You are a Jamaican brown man. You're the son of Mr. and Mrs. Mills up the road, etc., etc. So it's only in the US that I can get to a black guy. So because of that, I'm deeply grateful that in my immigration application I accepted, because ever since then I've been having a successful career as a black guy. But in Jamaica, no. Okay, now imagine, and I'm sure there's some science fiction fans here, imagine the parallel universe, okay? Favorite theme of science fiction writers. Classic example, the South wins World War II. Sorry, not the South, that's a bit confused. The South wins the Civil War, the Nazis win World War II. So the idea is, the world is radically changed. Okay, so consider this possible world. It's the Dark Ages. Okay, so Europe is sunken in a superstition, barbarism, etc., etc. So a group of Africans who have some time on their hands say, hey, I know what let's do. Let's get in our ships and let's sail north and discover Europe. And everyone says, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So they sail north and they link up with the Moors in Spain and they link up with the forces of Islam in the east and they overrun Dark Ages Europe. And what they do is they establish a racial dictatorship. This is a racial dictatorship of people of color. And white people, these barbarians, these are seen as savages and so forth. In such a world, you could have a situation where the one-drop rule is then applied in reverse. So that any white blood is now sort of evidence of contamination, inferiority, etc., etc. So in such an alternative Europe, I, Charles Mills, would now be a white guy. But the difference is, of course, that I would not be a privileged white guy. I'd be a white guy at the back of the bus, or I guess since it's medieval times, at the back of the ox cart or whatever. So the idea is that the same person before Charles, the same biological person, will be racialized 3 different ways in 3 different racial systems. 2 real-life ones, the US and Jamaica, and 1 sort of hypothetical counterfactual one, the sort of alternative Europe. And in each case, the kind of experiences I would have would be significantly different. because of the fact that my schedule of opportunities, the kind of rights and freedoms I had, how I was perceived, the kind of culture which I would have access, would all be severely shaped by the social structure of race. So the point is to emphasize that race need not be biological for race to be completely real. And this is the point that critical race theorists have been pushing in various disciplines. And the point is to say you need a metaphysics of race which recognizes simultaneously the reality of race and the socially constructed nature of that reality. Okay, so that's my position, race, and as I say, in general, people work in this field. So we now think of race as different. We don't think of race as in these biological terms. We think of a racialized social system. So it's kind of stuff that Eric likes, the sociology. So you think of a racialized social system, and then the reality of race being relative to that system. So it means that race can change over space, as I just indicated, if I sort of go home to Jamaica, and can change over time. You can have the evolution of a given racial system so that the racial rules change. And there's some people who argue that the US is undergoing a period of Latinization. Now they're moving towards the Latin model. And the Latin model historically has been different from the US model, because the Latin model has been one in which, rather than sort of sharply dichotomized thing, white versus non-white, with black being the most important component of the non-white category, what you've had is a racial spectrum. You have a situation where you have a whole series of colors, so much so that there are many people who will be sort of categorized as black in the US who are not seen as such, and who do not see themselves as such. So part of the difficulty of getting off the ground a black power movement in a country like Brazil, for example, which has the largest, by US standards, black population in the Western Hemisphere, has been because of these internal differentiations. No, I'm not black, and this particular shade of brown, this guy is the sort of shade that's somewhat low, etc., etc. There's some people suggest that the US is moving towards that rather than white supremacy, you're going to have beige supremacy. So you have a sort of opening up of whiteness in which light-skinned Latinos, maybe light-skinned blacks, some Asian blues will be let in, and then you still have darker-skinned peoples at the bottom, but the rules of whiteness will be relaxed somewhat. So, sort of stay tuned and see if this happens. Okay, so race as real, but the metaphysics is not biological, the reality is social. Okay, so you could have all kinds of different racial systems, and you can imagine, as I say, interesting science fiction novels written on these different systems. But in our world, obviously, the most important system is the system of white domination. And that's, of course, because the modern world is shaped by European expansionism. So this is a global racial system, and also the system in most countries. And this is a system that some people think we need to sort of revive the term white supremacy. Oh, now there's the downside of this terminology, and I've encountered this downside often when I try to sort of put this argument across. It sounds extremist. It sounds like you're Louis Farrakhan, ranting on TV or some these weird hangovers from the 60s who don't realize, my God, this was 40 years ago, guys. Get with the program. So you're still talking about white supremacy when there's a black man in the White House, and you're talking about a black man in the White House, a black attorney general, and you're talking about white supremacy. You must be crazy. Okay, so here's the argument. So as philosophers emphasize, it all depends on how you define your terms. Okay, so here's my definition. I hope you won't think it's too tangential. So that's bottom of the page. Systemic, significant, unfair, white advantage, established by white causality, actions and inactions, maintained in place by white causality, actions and inactions. Okay, then you break it down. Systemic is not a matter of individual transactions. Significant is more than minor differences. Of course, you can't always quantify it, but things like differentials in life expectancies, in people in prison, in income, in wealth, in degrees of segregation, on all those measures, it's still the case that you have major differences. And 6-7 months into Obama's presidency, we don't see any change in those. And he was not elected on a racial justice program, let's face it. Had he campaigned on a racial justice program, he would never have been elected. He was able to be elected by staying, his handlers have made it clear, in the interviews that have come out after the thing. We want to present him as a guy who happens to be black rather than a black candidate, and that's who has been elected. So those things are still the same. Okay, what's the source of them? Well, only some theories, white people are smarter, so what they expect. White people are less prone to criminal action, so there's nothing surprising about that. So you reject those theories, of course, if you're on the left, and you say, no, this isn't a matter of superior white abilities, this isn't a matter of superior white moral character, this is a matter of discriminatory social structures and the way they tend to reproduce themselves. And the key point, which many whites are very reluctant to accept, white advantage. that it's not just the case that there happen to be structures that whites benefit from them. And the statistic I always use, which I'm sure most people here will be familiar with, that this book came out 10 years ago, White Wealth, Black Wealth, Melvin Oliver, Thomas Shapiro. And they pointed out, which was quite path-breaking at the time, that it's a mistake to focus narrowly on questions of income. So the usual measure of racial differentials was income differentials, median white household, median black household. And they said that if you look at the sort of impact of wealth in a capitalist economy, in terms, for example, of surviving a medical catastrophe, in terms of keeping yourself afloat if you're going to be laid off, in terms of passing something on to your kids, in terms of down payment on a house, wealth is far more significant as a sort of long-term indicator of racial inequality than income is. And the stats on wealth are truly remarkable. The median white household has 10 times the wealth of the median black household. And there's a particular technical thing, something like net financial assets, which is different from wealth, which includes stuff like liquid and semi-liquid, actually stuff like mutual funds and so forth. And the figure there, median white household, median black household, is 100 to 1, so huge. Let me see if I can get this right. 1870. Okay, so there's sometime, I think it's like after Civil War, about 1865, 1870. The percentage of national wealth controlled by black Americans, half of 1%. Not surprising, under slavery, you don't get sorts of laid that much away in your 401k or 403b, so you can't accumulate that stuff, so not that surprising. Fast forward to 1990, okay, so this is 135 years later, so we've had this civil rights legislation in the 50s and 60s, we have the rise of Michael and Oprah, 1990. Percentage of US wealth controlled by the black American population, wait for it, 1%. So in 135 years, it has doubled. So at that level of progress, and by the year 5000 or so, if the planet is still here, and that's when it's all the seawater. So that gives you a sense of a sort of extremity of these divisions. So there's white advantage. And then the point is, it's established by white causality actions and inactions. Now I have a section of conspiracy theories. Do I need to go through this for this sophisticated crowd here? Because often people say, okay, it's just a conspiracy theory. And what I have to point out to people is, look, you seem to say there are two main alternatives. Either things just happen or it's a conspiracy. And clearly it's a dichotomization which is somewhat false, right? Because there's all kinds of stuff which does not involve a conspiracy, but does involve coordinated white causality. And the obvious point against conspiracy theory is that most of this stuff was done in the open. So insofar as a conspiracy theory by definition presupposes stuff being done in quiet, is not a conspiracy. Slavery, it's not that you could sort of conceal slavery. There are all these guys in the cotton fields, right? Slavery is open, Jim Crow is open, votes in Congress are open, Supreme Court decisions are open, this stuff is all public. There's some conspiratorial stuff, there's a Klan, there's white citizens' councils, but for the most part there's stuff done in the open. So there's a pattern of coordinated white causality. And part of the whole point of saying that we need to revise social ontologies is that this category might sound odd, precisely because people in race would say, you've had the sort of underrepresentation of people of color in the academy sort of making these points. So coordinated white causality aimed at a certain end, that needs to be sort of gotten on the table in sociological theory, because this kind of stuff happens all the time. It's not a conspiracy being done in the open. Okay, and then at the bottom, I have what I think is a nice sort of diagram which suggests 6 of the main aspects of white supremacy. Juridico-political, economic, cognitive, evaluative, cultural, somatic, ontological. So if there's time for us, we can get into that later. But let's dash on to some other stuff. So first 2 sections, liberalism and race. Now, liberalism and race, historical. Okay, liberalism, the ideology of individual rights and freedoms, challenging ascriptive hierarchy, saying these feudal estates are bad. Clearly, liberalism is going to be, in principle, opposed to racism. Right? Wrong. Utterly wrong. The problem is that liberalism, historically, has been more often complicit with racism and white supremacy than in opposition to it. Not without exception. There have been some principled exceptions, but a large amount of a significant number of classical liberals have basically been complicit. Okay, so sociology beliefs, so once again I'm treading on Eric's territory. Sociology belief 101, but you see I'm at the very baby level, so you won't feel that, maybe I can get, as a philosopher, I can get that part right at least. Okay, sociology belief 101. What does this tell us? It tells us that ideas and concepts do not develop in this sort of Platonized realm where one concept gives birth to another concept, it gives birth to another concept. It's not like that at all. Human beings, particularly embedded human beings in particular social locations, they're the ones who think of the concepts, they're the ones who develop concepts, they're the ones who develop the arguments, and those thinkers in the Western tradition have been predominantly male, class privileged, and overwhelmingly white. So what we'd expect from Sociology Belief 101 is that the dominant variety of liberalism is going to be patriarchal, classist, racial liberalism. And lo and behold, we're not surprised at all, this is in fact what it is. So it's not a matter, or it's less a matter of people's individual sexism or racism. In other words, you can do that, and that can have its particular insights, but it's more illuminated to sort of look at a body of theory linked with a group. As I say, sort of basic sociology belief, whether you want to look at Mannheim, whether you want to look at Marxism, the idea is, how does this group positioning affect the way you see the world, affect the ideas you take up, affect the way you develop those ideas, which sort of developments you find plausible, which developments you find implausible, etc., etc. So that's the more sort of useful way to think of it. So as I said, patriarchal liberalism as a concept, that's familiar by now because of the work of feminist theorists, underrepresentation of people of color. The idea of racial liberalism is a less familiar one. I suggest we need to sort of get this concept on the table also. Okay, racial liberalism. So here's another diagram. I suggest we can sort of truly demarcate two main varieties of racial liberalism. First, there's racist liberalism, that's overtly racist. And that's a kind where you have derogatory representation of people of color as not fully human, as members of the animal kingdom, as maybe a kind of missing link between us white humans and the rest of the animal kingdom, etc., etc. And you can find those writings, but clearly we're not in that time period anymore. It's only in the sort of extremist fringe groups, Ku Klux Klan, Aryan Nation, going to find that kind of stuff nowadays. So you might think, well, okay, so that's all past, thank God. We're now in this sort of realm of universal, all-encompassing liberalism where everybody really is included. And my claim is going to be, no, we're not. We're still in racial liberalism, but now of a much more subtle and elusive kind. And my argument is that this liberalism is still racial in the sense that it's conceptually oriented. It's in philosophical terms, it's meta-ethically oriented by the interests, by the sort of position in the world of the dominant white population. And as such, it's still racialized in a far more subtle way that sort of requires work to excavate. So part of what I'm trying to do in my work is sort of try to show, here's this liberal theory, which seems it now includes everybody, and really, there's still these racial biases running through it. So in classic patriarchal liberalism, of course, the idea is women are inferior beings, their role is to serve men, and their appropriate zone of social existence is a household. So you get this sharp distinction, public sphere, private sphere. So in terms of a conceptual cartography, that's how we map the socio-political realm. There's a public sphere, that's the economy, that's the realm of politics, that's where we are, then women are here, and this zone is kind of naturalistic, it's ahistorical, there's no change. So in a sort of classic sexist mapping, and of course, part of the whole point of the work of second wave feminism that sort of dealt in the 60s and 70s is to challenge that. And to say that the personal is in many ways political, that there are sort of relations of patriarchal power connecting both spheres, etc. So the feminist critique is saying, look, this is supposed to be a liberalism which is now inclusive, but in fact it continues to sort of maintain many of the conceptual distinctions and mappings inherited from the previous overtly sexist kind. And as such, women are still disadvantaged by that. Okay, what is equivalent in race to the sort of role of the household in gender theory? Well, obviously, it's relation between Europe and non-Europe as it develops in the modern period through European expansionism and relations of Aboriginal expropriation, African slavery, later colonization, Jim Crow, etc. So the white, non-white relation, that's a sort of crucial point, sort of interface where we'd expect the sort of manifestations of racial liberalism to take place. So in the original overtly racist kind, people of color are represented in a racist way, and you have doctrines of international law, like the doctrine of discovery, which basically says, hey, we land there, there's no real humans there, it's ours. Doctrine of terror. Harry had mentioned the book I just did with Carole Pateman. Carole taught she's British origin, but she taught for some years in Australia. And she had an interest at that point in the doctrine of terra nullius. And what terra nullius basically says is that there's nobody really here. Now there are these sort of creatures running about, but they're not really human. So in a sense, the whole land is empty. And Australia, the sort of modern country of Australia, was founded on this doctrine. So part of the Aboriginal movement has been sort of going to get this doctrine overturned, which there was this official recognition under the new Labour, but not so new anymore. The new Labour government, there was a sort of official, there's a National Be Sorry Day and stuff like that. There's nothing practical yet in terms, how sorry are you? We're very sorry. How sorry? We're really sorry. Are you sorry enough to give money? We're not that sorry. So there are limitations on how sorry white Australians are. But anyway, that's the sort of principle. So in the book we did together, she has this long chapter, this sort of tour de force, which sort of looks at terra nullius in 3 countries, US, Canada, and Australia, and sort of traces how this doctrine sort of justifies the political systems established in these countries. Okay, so you have this sort of representation of people of color as inferior, and people that philosophers anyway think of as sort of crucial members of the canon. It turns out that they play a crucial role. So Locke, I hope this will not sort of shatter anybody's illusions. Illusions will shatter. Okay, so Locke has investments in the slave trade as an investor in the Royal Africa Company. And the second treatise of government has been argued by various people such as James Tully to sort of justify Native American expropriation. Hume speculates that all the other species of men are inferior to whites and they're not capable of civilization. And Jamaica, my homeland, comes into a special reference because he says there's this Negro they speak of, who's a guy from Jamaica who seems to have some intelligence, but really it's just like a parrot. He's heard this stuff and he repeats it. So he has sort of intelligence of a parrot, but not much more. Kant, big name, as we know, the most important ethicist of the past few hundred years. There's some people now claiming that Kant is the most important foundational theorist of modern scientific racism. Scientific in quotes, of course, the idea that he's putting racism as sort of system, and this is a guy with a big brain, as you know, always thinking. And they say that the sort of Kantian formulation of racial theory is far more sophisticated than anything that comes before. So Kant then has a sort of dubious credit of being simultaneously the father of modern moral theory and the father of modern racist theory. So the point is here, these key Enlightenment figures, key liberals, and they all have racist views, and argue that these racist views shape the way their principles are applied. So things we sort of link with liberalism: self-ownership, Lockean self-ownership, civilization, Kantian autonomy, full personhood, corporate development, contributes to world history, they're all shaped by race. So you have a racialized social ontology, this is going back to categories on the B, and a Eurocentric cartography, C, and then you get a color-coded schedule of rights and protections, D, and there's a sort of vision of history as a triumph of Europe. So modernity is basically European, and it's basically European triumphing over what Eric Wolff has a famous book, The Peoples Without History. Okay, and then as I say, contemporary narratives basically sanitize this, and the actual history has been obfuscated. Okay, finally, section 4, a possible retrieval. So given this history, why even bother? And as I say, those of my friends who are sort of not returning my calls anymore, the idea is, Jesus Christ, Charles, why are you trying to retrieve this dead theory, this corrupt racist theory? And I say, please bear with me, I'm going to show you how it can be done. Okay, so why should we even bother with liberalism? Well, there are a number of reasons why. One is that it's globally hegemonic. With the collapse of self-described socialist states, sort of the Thatcher and Reagan revolutions. Of course, there's been a shift somewhat back to the center now, of course, with the financial meltdown and so forth. But liberalism is based on sort of the global player. And in terms of distinguishing between, sort of academics and sort of left groups, and listen, I don't say this in the derogatory because I was once a grad student also. In terms of doing a radical thing on campus, and in terms of influencing real-world politics, liberalism has far greater leverage. Because what you're doing is saying, okay, these are the values you nominally have. Well, according to your own values, this is unjust and you should be doing something about it. As again saying, I've just read Discipline and Punishment, I've just read the Order of Things, it therefore follows you, congressman, need to do this and this. I'm not saying you shouldn't read Foucault, I'm just saying that in terms of sort of practicability, in terms of getting things going, I think there's a case to be made for intervening within liberalism, even if you sort of read the other stuff also. So we should not be sort of giving up on it. So here's my crucial point. So this is paragraph 3. If liberalism often seems hopelessly retrograde and reactionary to progressives, could it be in part because we're basically sort of taking as essential to liberalism what is a specific contingent incarnation. In other words, male, bourgeois, white liberalism is basically assumed to exhaust liberalism, to be coextensive with liberalism as such. And this potential for liberalism to have a radical agenda, we're basically sort of ignoring that because our consciousness is so colonized by the varieties of liberalism that have been dominant for several hundred years. Okay, and then I just run quickly through what you could say the big three of class, gender, and race. So the social democratic critique, okay, now the Marx critique is more complicated, and we can sort of talk about that in internet people want. The social democratic critique is basically people are not atomic individuals, members of classes. Freedom and equality is not realizable for the majority under laissez-faire. Okay, so you guys get the freedom, free and equal, but you can't have this kind of social system and realize liberal values for the rest of the population. And that means you need state intervention, that means you need redistribution, that means you need to recognize how economic power translates into political power, that means you need to sort of expand your schedule of rights, taking into account welfare rights, so-called positive rights, etc. Feminist critique, women are excluded from individual status, public sphere, private sphere demarcation, obfuscates gender privileging, rights must be written to eliminate patriarchal privilege, etc. So the racial critique, I suggest, you can run a parallel argument. People are not atomic individuals, members of different races, people of color have denied equal status. We need to see racial domination as a political system analogous to patriarchy, but those still sympathetic to left theory, analogous to sort of class domination, sort of old Marxist vision of a ruling class. And we see white supremacy in that way. And that means you then need to sort of ask yourself, how has white supremacy manifested itself, not merely locally in the US, but you can make a case globally. Now, if the discourse on global justice, you just have to say much about race, but you can make an argument that the inequalities in the world have a significant link with the sort of historical imposition of European rule, the establishment of economic structures which disadvantage some nations and privilege some, and as such, a case can be made that racial justice is not merely local, in a sense, racial justice is global. So my claim then is once you separate A from the contingent versions of B, C, D, and E, none of these critiques actually challenges liberalism in principle. What they challenge are particular versions of liberalism, the versions that have become dominant. And my claim is, so this is sort of final wrap-up, it is not inconsistent with liberalism that in trying to guarantee A, the heart of liberalism, the moral equality, freedom and rights of individuals, that we take into account their group memberships, we develop mappings of society and the polity that sort of track how, in this case, race affects power and social status, and we can then say, on this basis, we need a rewritten schedule of rights that will sort of take account of this historical disadvantaging, and that's then going to be linked with a history of these groups that sort of brings out this now buried, because embarrassing, racist history. And there's just this final note that I'd like to end on. It was only a few years ago, now maybe you guys knew this all along, it was only a few years ago that I discovered this great episode, great in the sense not of being wonderful, in the sense of wonderful illustrating. So it's 1919, okay? It's after World War I, the Versailles Conference. And the nations are gathering. We don't want anything like this terrible war to happen again. So the League of Nations covenant is being drawn up. And this time period, of course, the world is dominated by the European powers. There are hardly any countries of people of color that are independent. The British Empire, French, Dutch, etc. There are hardly any independent countries of color. Japan is one of those few countries. The Japanese delegation says we need a clause in the League of Nations covenant that says we're committed to racial equality. So this is 1919, okay? So we're deep into modernity. We're not talking about in the 14th or 15th century. And freedom and equality as a basic liberal principle is supposed to have been established from the 17th, 18th century on. Racial equality. You're not asking for socialism, not even asking for decolonization. There's a commitment to racial equality. And this proposal by the Japanese delegation is vetoed by the 6 Anglo-Saxon nations, that being number 1, England, of course, the good old USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. So this is a sort of wonderful historical episode in illustrating the extent to which, less than 100 years ago, liberalism was conceived of in such racialized terms that these nations had no problem at all in vetoing racial equality. Are you crazy? That's not what this is about. So existing liberalism and racial liberalism, we need to get a de-racialized liberalism that recognizes this past history. Thank you.
One of the things that interests me is how racism can appropriate forms that don't necessarily have anything to do with it. Now, I was struck by your comments about black wealth holding. It would seem that if you look back at the 1960s, a lot of those urban uprisings were in part commodity riots. Right? They were about people seizing goods that they otherwise couldn't have. Now, the short-term solution to that has been the expansion of credit, and including like rent-to-own places, and so that you can have goods without having wealth. So I guess my question to you is, how do we deal with the way that racism can assume different forms, but still maintain its framework? Another example would be the way in the 19th century blacks were thought to be too primitive to be good athletes. And now the stereotype is that blacks can be good athletes and nothing else. What remains constant is that racist framework that unites those seemingly disparate groups. So, I don't know, any thoughts about?
Right, it's a very good question. It shows the extent to which racism mutates. So there's a danger that you have expositions and safeguards that are basically designed to catch one variety of racism that misses others. Because, naturally we're going to sort of learn from history, but the question is, has history moved on? And your point about athletes was really, I think, sort of brought home very well. If you think of the 1936 Berlin Olympics, okay? So this is the Olympics, that Adolf Hitler is there to see Aryan victory. Because in that time period, part of racial superiority is also supposed to be athletic superiority. So Jesse Owens, the black American sprinter, Jesse Owens' 4 gold medals, a major blow to that. Because the idea is, how can this black guy be sort of winning all this stuff when the Aryan is supposed to be the sort of superior race in all these fields? And now, as you say, the athletic sphere has been largely conceded and has been turned around. In fact, there's a book called Darwin's Athletes. And the author basically says that black athletic success has really only served to sort of confirm racism. Okay, that's what they're good for. They're not good for anything else. And if you're a track and field fan, if you watch the Olympics or the recent games, as a Jamaican, you understand, I take a special interest in those. You see these races, and you see all these black sprinters, and there's the black French guy, there's a black Lithuanian, there's a black Icelander, and there's native blacks in Iceland, but hey, all these black sprinters run for all these European nations. On one hand, it's really fun, but on the other hand, it really does sort of reinforce the stereotype. Only black people can run fast, so yeah, it does have that side effect, I agree. And going back to the first part of your point, you could look at Katrina as a good example, where the black population saw this very much in racial terms, and large sections of the white population said, yes, it's terrible, but didn't see it as racial. Because they've learned to sort of identify race with a particular set, with white and colored signs, with the Ku Klux Klan, with overt discrimination, rather than things like sort of lending patterns, structural disadvantage. And there have been stories on the whole crisis in terms of what I don't mean technical stuff, but in terms of derivatives and mortgages. And part of that is sort of low-income people trying desperate to get a piece of the pie and signing on to stuff that was really a way of ripping them off. So yes, you're absolutely right that race is not going to present itself as such. That you need, in a sense, to sort of excavate and show the extent to which race underlies things. And often, it's going to sort of meet a lot of resistance. And people want to say, well, that's not really race at all. So I don't have any easy answers, if that's
so you think that the permeability of liberalism, its ability to be invaded by race, does not say something about the intrinsic character of liberalism itself?
No, because you see, what I would claim, and this goes back to a sort of position that I think is sort of, this is a term now that nobody uses anymore because we're in a postmodern age. But I would sort of see that kind of analysis, a kind of idealist analysis, in the sense that it's saying that the ideas themselves have this dynamic. And I would favor a materialist analysis which would say, what are the group interests of the people who have these ideas. So the way that liberalism develops and sort of dodges and shifts and shapes, I see that as ultimately attributable to the group interests of the people involved, the group interests of the white population. And I see that you could have opposing group interests of people of color and anti-racist whites who can develop a liberalism that is anti-racist. So I would locate it not in terms of the intrinsic conceptual features of the theory, I would locate it in terms of the group interests of the people who have the theory.
But interests have to be argued. This is all about ideas in some ways. Could you go back to the association of liberalism and racism in some of the milestone figures that you list on page 4, and just talk a little bit more about how these folks were able to reconcile, did they even see a need to reconcile the racism with the liberalism? I think central to the issue is this question that you mentioned here about capacities.
Yeah.
That it's, yes, it says equality, but it turns a lot on views about capacities.
Absolutely.
Could you just
expand
on that?
Yes, certainly. Yes, there's an excellent book I could recommend by a guy called Uday Singh Mehta, Mehta, and his book is called Liberalism and Empire. And it's basically a sort of intense focus on Locke and Mill. And what he says, what he argues in the book is that liberalism presents itself as this universalist, all-inclusive egalitarian theory, but in fact, they're prerequisites to being a person of the full standing that would enable you to enjoy these full rights and freedoms. And he argues that there's a kind of built-in anthropology, and that anthropology is so designed, well, at the time anyway, so that your people of color did not really make it. And Mill, of course, as we know, is an employee of the British East India Company, so he's part of a colonial enterprise. So Mill is not a biological racist. He does make some remarks. I mean, he wrote a lot, but he's basically seen not as a biological racist, but he's somebody who saw these Indians cannot really rule over themselves at this stage. Okay, so it's a developmental thing. At some future stage, they may be able to rule over them, but right now they cannot. So liberal rights and freedoms, in terms of what's a prerequisite for being self-governing, that has to take account this cultural backwardness. And his famous book, the book that's sort of assigned in like sort of every intra-liberal arts course, his book on freedom. He says explicitly that the difference principle, not the difference principle, the harm principle. The harm principle, yes. The idea that you cannot interfere with people unless it's the harm or not. You can't interfere with people for their own good. He has this what seems like a throwaway line, so that if you didn't know the theoretical background, you wouldn't see that significant. He says, this does not apply, of course, to nations, or in the phrase, in their knowledge. So the idea is basically that this is generally true, but it's not generally true, consider how many nations are in their knowledge. But the idea is basically just for us. It's for us, the West, and these other nations, they're inferior. And you can easily read through it, because it sort of seems so incongruous with how you think of Mill, until you know there are all these other writings. Mill as a colonial theorist. Mill, the man whose father wrote this multi-volume history of India without ever setting foot in the place, the idea being that this would make him really objective. So it's not the case that I think they saw it as a tension. There's this interesting debate in US political science. Various people, Jennifer Hawkesby, Roger Smith. Should you see racism and US political culture, should you see it as an anomaly, or should you see it as sort of symbiotic, right? Yes, so you know. So the symbiosis analysis basically says that US liberalism develops in such a way as to accommodate race. So there's no tension because it's a symbiotic relationship. And my claim would be that you can sort of imagine this writ large on a global scale, that liberalism globally develops in such a way as to accommodate the subordination of people of color. So that in people like Locke, people like Mill, more controversial in case of people like Kant, They don't express attention on Hegel, of course, how to exactly classify it, but Hegel has this theory of history. There's a world historical continent, that is, surprise, Europe. There's Africa, sunk in barbarism. There's the East, where that has some potential. So the idea is there's a world spirit, and some people really do not make a contribution to the world spirit. So it's not that there's racism here and liberalism over here. Part of the analysis I'm trying to put together is that liberalism is racialized in its dominant versions, so that the way we think of people, the way we think of personhood, the way we think of the capacity for autonomy, there are racial prerequisites to that. And I want to emphasize that this is not the case for everybody. There are exceptions. Jennifer Pitts, who's now at the University of Chicago, she and her partner both work in this field. So his book is Enlightenment Against Empire. I'm blanking on his name. But she's Jennifer Pitts, and her book is called A Turn to Empire. And subtitle is The Rise of Imperial Liberalism in Britain and France. But the point she's making is that there was a time period when you get liberals who are condemning empire, condemning racism, and she has Adam Smith, for example, as an example of somebody who's taken a principled stand. And then she says you get sort of shift by the time of Mill, who's basically completely complicit. If you look at the Tocqueville's writings on Algeria and so forth. So the basic argument is that liberalism in its dominant version is racialized, so there's no actual tension there.
Just one little comment on this exchange. Liberalism also has a special treatment for children.
Yes.
And I think the racialized forms are kind of extensions.
Yes. These are per children, yes.
Yeah,
so it means that you have to have a kind of guardian relationship.
Right. So nobody, I think, feels that babies should have a full autonomy and rights.
Right.
So that's a kind of natural, inherent feature.
Sure.
And then the inferiority rhetoric is what sanitizes liberalism, makes it possible to.
Yes.
The substantive question I wanted to ask you had to do with the relationship between class radicalism and liberalism on the one hand, and the anti-racial liberalism that you're talking about. If the class egalitarian program, the anti-class oppression version of class egalitarian program is fully instituted in the Marxian mode, what would be left for the anti-racial liberalism to do? That is, if it's to each according to need, from each according to ability.
Yes.
Is there anything left for, you refer to compensatory justice. If we had compensatory justice for historically discriminated groups in a context where to each according to need was instituted, it would imply that some people would have to get more than they need.
Yes, sure. Yes.
Which would restore class inequality.
Right, yes. Yes, there are interesting tensions between the project of compensatory justice and a radical egalitarian project. Because the compensatory justice program presupposes, for example, some sense of entitlements, if not of all the way to sort of thick Lockean kind, at least in that direction. In other words, here's a classic example. What some people see as the worst race riot in U.S. history takes place in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. Some estimates are that as high as 300 people may have been killed. But in terms of what I want to focus on, this involves the burning down of what was called the Black Wall Street, the Greenwood District. Okay, so if these guys deserve compensation, that means you're restoring the property of the black capitalist class, okay? But as a radical egalitarian, you think that capitalism of all kinds is bad. So, okay, these guys, yeah, they lost, that's bad. But hey, all these guys are exploiters. So, we shouldn't start restoring their property. So it depends in part on what framework are you working in. I work within a framework we're going to say, okay, we need compensatory justice, and then we're going to sort of fight for socialism later on, and to fight for socialism right now, and as such, there's no point in giving these guys compensatory justice or what exactly. And there are tensions also in the following sense here. As you know, because of course class theory is your thing, the US is a very peculiar class society compared to the other Western nations, okay? Why is the US so different? Why is there no universal healthcare system? Why is there so much resistance? Why has there been no sort of national labor movement or national social democratic party comparable influence what we've had in Western European nations? Why is it that social democracy, let alone socialism, has found it so hard to operate on this soil? Well, different answers have been given. So people have said, well, there's a West, you can always go West if you're being screwed by the capitalists here, etc. But there are some people have said race has played a crucial role. And the reason being that racial consciousness has generally trumped class consciousness. So that white workers have tended to identify upwards, vertically, with their sort of co-racial white capitalists exploiting them rather than horizontally. If that analysis is correct, then could be, Eric, that the radical egalitarian class program cannot get off the ground until racial consciousness is dissipated, so that you sort of need the racial program first before the class program gets off. There's that
That's a strategic argument.
Yeah.
That's not an end state vision argument,
No,
it's a strategic
exactly, yes.
argument.
So, and just a brief follow-up. There are other dimensions to white supremacy other than just the straight economic ones. There's stuff like culture, there's stuff like reclaiming of history, there's stuff like the sort of stigmatization of black bodies against the white body, and there's stuff in terms of, if you think of the Holocaust, if you think of making whole, if you think of the need for apologies, these things play a symbolic role, and we argue that it's different from the sort of white working class experience. Aaron?
This sort of follows up from that. When you were defining white supremacy,
Yeah.
Because we've got the handout, we can refer to this.
Oh my God, I can't pretend I didn't say it.
So white,
Downside of having a handout.
so white advantage.
Yes.
White advantage is that what you say whites benefit from this system.
Yes.
So when I've got written down here, relative to what baseline. So if the story that you told Eric
Yes.
is true, then in fact whites don't benefit from this system. Most whites don't. Most whites are worse off relative to a baseline of social democracy which we might have achieved,
Right.
absent white, well, whether it is white supremacy or not, because in fact we have universal healthcare, we have all these sorts of measures in place that make most whites in Europe better off than most whites in the US.
Yes. I'm sorry. Go on.
So sure, whites do better out of the system than blacks do,
Yes.
but they don't do better out of the system than they would do if we didn't have the system.
Right. And that's an argument that has traditionally been used by the left. That okay, how do you develop a political movement against white supremacy? And there are two left versions. There's a right version. The right version is that race costs everybody. It's because if there are any fans of the Wire here? Oh, some fans of the Wire. Okay, think of these guys in the Wire. Think of these, cunning, devious, Stringer Bell, these criminals. Think of what great CEOs these guys would make, okay? So the idea is that you have people with sort of, entrepreneurial, go-getting, ruthless talent, and they're excluded because of racism. Bring them in, the GNP sort of expands, everybody gets better. So there's sort of right-wing argument. There are two left-wing arguments. There's a socialist argument and a social democratic argument, and they're variants of the theme. Socialism, comrade, you are comparing yourself, to this oppressed black guy, and you're saying, well, at least I'm doing better than him. You should be comparing yourself to how you could be doing under socialism. That's where the comparison should be. And if you do that comparison, you then see you're actually worse off than you could be. And that's an argument the left have sort of traditionally used, yes. And unfortunately, it has not gained that much purchase. And the question is why? Is it because the socialist vision has just not seemed plausible? That's one route. There's another route, which is this. Suppose the wages of whiteness, so this is a phrase that goes back to Du Bois, and then David Rode's work has made it popular. Okay, so look at this weird one at the end, ontological. I didn't stick that in there just because the person on the AP is going to sort of here monitoring my talk. The reason for that one is this. There's some goods that are positional. They're positional in that you have them in relation to somebody else having an inferior position. Now, there are some time periods in the US when it has been important to white people to be white for whiteness' sake. In other words, you're a member of the superior race, and you cannot be a member of the superior race unless someone's a member of the inferior race. And there's some people who have argued that part of white resistance to this left agenda has been that you then have a situation where you could be doing better economically, but you're no longer positioned as a member of the superior race. And that this is so psychologically important to you that you're going to resist these measures. So if that's true, it would mean that a traditional left analysis has been developed and sophisticated to sort of take account of this fact that in this new world, which has all these sort of these social structures that Marx did not think of, racial structure has a dimension other than a straight sort of rational choice economic payoff. It also has a sort of status dimension to it.
There's some hands over on that.
It's so fascinating, but a lot of it seems to be looking forward and change over time and so on. And I'm wondering if you have anything to say to the guy that's homeless tonight,
right,
to the guy that's in jail because the DA worked him over because the system let him do it.
So because the TA?
DA.
Well, I think that you had really aggressive teaching system. You would not turn the paper like that against us. Yes, sir.
Because the way the system currently exists,
yes,
the injustice that's happening tonight.
Yes. Right, okay. Okay. I guess what I'd say is this. I've focused narrowly on race. The reason for that is in part because in philosophy, at least, when I first started working, so it was about 10, 15 years ago, there was not that much being done. There's still not that much being done, okay? I'm not at all saying that racial oppression is the only kind. I'm focusing one dimension on that because of the sort of underrepresentation of work in this area. But you're absolutely right. This is the point that I take you to be making, that there are other dimensions of oppression, that there's class oppression of the white working class, that the recent development of the economy has screwed the white working class. I mean, as we all know, there's this massive transfer of wealth upwards to the top, point-something% at the top. Real wages have stagnated. I'm certainly not denying that there's a whole sort of all sort of levels of class subordination of white work that have been addressed also. I am focusing narrowly on race, but I would not want you to think that it's because I think the only kind of oppression is race.
Well, yeah, I guess I'm sorry. I was presuming that we were thinking about a black man.
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood you completely. I thought you were saying, what about the poor white workers?
No.
Okay,
no.
Miss the point completely. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay, what about the poor black man who's screwed? Read the racial contract. No. Yeah, sure. There's all kinds of stuff that needs to be done. Obviously, I mean, what we need in the country is a movement that will force Obama left. I mean, for some people at least, that's why he was elected. But he's not going to. I mean, it's a standard analysis that was given up about Roosevelt. That it's only when there's a sort of perceived crisis, mass movements, that he made certain kinds of moves, and that there's something comparable with Obama, and that the temporizing, the vacillating, the attempt to conciliate the right people that cannot be conciliated. There needs to be a movement to sort of put backbone in what was the sort of potentially progressive, not outright social democratic, but at least somewhat so to alarm people like Charles Krauthammer, so which is obviously something positive. So there needs to be a movement to sort of address those things, yes, certainly. But this is philosophy, right? So what can I say? It's not directly interpreted. I'd like to think it has more potential being applied than other philosophy, but it's not directly applied stuff, no.
I would like to keep my question strictly on the ideal level.
Okay.
And I ask, what is unique about race on the ideal level that needs to be considered in theory that's the same as, let's say, gender? Because I see with the idea of, let's say, thinking of talent, there may be something unique about the male-female relationship that we need to consider gender when looking at talent. But what's unique about race that needs to be considered in ideal theory that's not being considered now?
Okay, you mean that's not being considered within philosophy or the academy?
So, I mean, you've written about Rawls and
right,
his relationship with race, but what's unique in, let's say, Rawls, that his neglect of race prevents him from seeing certain injustices on race?
Okay, I should emphasize, I'm going to talk more about this more. I should emphasize that I never met a man, I don't think he's a racist. He produced more than one black student. There's a woman who's at Cornell, Michelle Moody Adams. She's a Rawls student. There's another famous woman who's also an artist, Adrian Piper. She might have been a Rawls student. Anyway, I'm not saying Rawls is a racist.
No,
you take it right, yeah. I think he became so immersed in this world of ideal theory and the problems generated by it that he developed a kind of tunnel vision. He says explicitly in A Theory of Justice that the problems of non-ideal theory are the pressing ones. So you'd think then, well, if they're the pressing ones, let's sort of turn to them. But the idea is, he claimed, you need ideal theory to sort of provide a proper foundation for understanding them. So this then becomes an exercise which occupies him for the next 30 years, basically. So I guess you'd have to delve in part into roles in psychology. And also, I think, the fact that racial justice, I'm going to talk about this more, is very much a non-traditional subject within philosophy. Outside philosophy, you can find all kinds of books on racial justice. Racial justice, criminal justice, in education, there's all kinds of stuff. The irony is that the discipline whose subject matter is supposed to be peculiar to justice, that's the discipline that is not talking about racial justice.